Hello everyone, welcome to my Yakuza Kiwami Legend difficulty walkthrough. This is part 2 of chapter 6, and we're dealing with Asai in this video. And this is a garbage fight. This is absolutely atrocious. The amount of bloopers I've saved for this really speaks for itself, just how bad this fight is, and there's some wonderful grab detection just then. One of the many issues that I encountered when I was doing this particular section. And said issues include getting the camera stuck into walls because of how tiny this room is, the camera speed being way too slow, that I even try to check in the settings to see if I can increase the speed, and you can't. The times where the enemies just stun lock you to death because the room is way too small and there's way too many enemies. Phantom range, bad detection on the heat actions, the times when you're going to the grab animation in the brawler stance and you get hit because the grab is way too slow. Same with the B stance, and you get stun locked too much when you're in the B stance, and the B stance is needed if you're trying to clear out a whole bunch of enemies, but I didn't bother doing it here because the amount of times I got hit while in the B stance is way too high. It's a garbage section. It's no different to the first encounter in chapter 6. This one's just worse because Asai has a knife and you cannot disarm him of that knife. I purchased an ability to do a heat action on bladed enemies when you have climax heat, and it doesn't work on this guy because he's a boss variant. There is no reason for a boss to get some kind of exclusion from heat actions. He's no different to any standard enemy. He's just a big guy with a knife. Why can't you do these kind of heat actions against bosses? It doesn't make any sense. And all of it is done this way to validate the boss's status as a boss. Because he's a boss, he therefore has certain principles and properties that just allow him to bypass the rules of the game, and it makes certain abilities in your skill tree system worthless. You know a game that doesn't have this kind of problem? Resident Evil 4. The final boss of Resident Evil 4, which is Sadler, he doesn't have any kind of special property that allows him to ignore the rules of the game. He takes consistent heat stun from high-powered weapons, like grenades. He has ways of actually flinching him, where you can actually shoot his eyeballs, and he goes down, and you can actually damage him. He flinches from explosive barrels, and he actually flinches from other stuff in the environment. Just the amount of systems they put into Sadler, despite the fact that he's the final boss, and he didn't want to resort to this arbitrary system of just giving him all these properties he doesn't deserve. That's commendable on Shinji Mikami's part. In fact, now that I'm talking about Shinji Mikami and Resident Evil 4, what would this game be like if it was actually designed by Capcom? Do you think the Yakuza series would be a lot better if it was designed by Capcom? Because Capcom were known for being like champions of games like Devil May Cry, and Devil May Cry, they put a lot of emphasis on making sure the hitboxes are perfectly fine and all these kind of things that actually benefit a functional game and actually made the game difficult for all the right reasons. Like, I'm betting there's people out there who think, oh, Yakuza Kiwami, it's good to have all these kind of holes in the designs because then it makes this game actually difficult. If this game actually had a functional system, then you would be able to do this game easily and it wouldn't be difficult. Well, that right there, guys, is just paradoxical thinking. A broken game is somehow a functional game. What, you think a broken PC is somehow a functional PC? Do you have any idea how retarded that statement is? There are so many other ways you can make this game difficult without giving the player all these vulnerabilities that aren't deserved, without any kind of fault in the decision-making process of the developers, and without making the enemies bullshit. I mean, it's stupid. You fight the mechanics more so than the actual enemies. That's just what it feels like in Chapter 6. You fight the game more so than the actual enemies. And at that point, you can't even talk about difficulty when the difficulty is not about anything that's happening within the game. It's the game itself, like the game as a whole. That's what you're fighting for the most part, compared to what's actually in the game. There is no argument to be made about difficulty at that point. And I've now gotten rid of all the minions and I'm out to deal with Asai. Asai is a very unique boss because he can't actually be stunned from behind with the rush combo. He has this ability to turn while you're stunning him from the back, but he can't do that when you hit his front. He doesn't try to dodge or anything. He just tries to block, and he doesn't get hyper armor a lot of the times if you're maintaining continuous hits with your rush combo. So this guy, he doesn't stand a chance against the rush combo. You can safely attack him from the front, and he can't do anything. I mean, that right there, he dodged. If he had dodged to the side, that would have been a problem. And speaking of dodging, this was the fight where I really noticed that the dodge that you do with the rush combo, it has problems. Because the amount of times I was pushing forward on the left analog stick, and Kiryu would go either left or right, and he would not go straight, and I ended up dodging into an enemy's attack and getting stun locked. That's yet again another situation where you're fighting the game more so than the actual enemies. That's the only reason the enemies would even come across as being difficult, if they require all these kind of vulnerabilities on yourself, and all these cheap artificial handicaps to feign lethality, because of the way the game is programmed. Like, that right there is not a game. This is a joke. This is a catastrophe. That's what it is. This is just universal levels of bullshit with the way this game is designed. And I can only speculate as to what the original games were like. I bet the original games were pretty bad, because I heard Servum 17 mention that those games didn't really work that well. I mean, from the initial gameplay I've seen of Yakuza 1, Yakuza 1 is very simple, and the bosses don't seem to have a lot of these properties where they hyper armor for the most part, or any of these other properties present within this game that just allow them to cheat. I mean, that's probably only because I've seen the early part of Yakuza 1 and not the later part, so I can't speak for that. But I've finally done a Sai, and we're just going to do a little bit more before I conclude this part of the video at the beginning of Shota's boss fight. And seeing as how we have a bit of downtime where we're just fighting a bunch of these scrubbers, and then we're also just doing a bunch of menial tasks, I'm just going to go on a different tangent. And like I said before, what would this game be like if it was designed by Capcom? Like, I have a lot of faith in Capcom when it comes to how they design games. I mean, I know a lot of people hate the Street Fighter games, at least the later entries, and I've never been a big fan of those kind of fighting games where you're forced to be in a two-dimensional plane, and you're only able to go, like, left or right, or jump up, or crouch down. I've never been a fan of those kind of games where you don't have a lot of options at your disposal when it comes to basic movement. I mean, yes, you have a lot of the command normals and a lot of the other button actions that you can do, but, you know, the ability to actually move in combat is one of the most important facets to a combat system, and it's why I can appreciate 3D games more so than 2D games. Plus, I just think it's logical and a lot more realistic. I mean, you're not going to just sit around in a two-dimensional plane. Like, you're going to be running all over the place trying to get the drop on an enemy, and also waiting for any vulnerabilities to be apparent where you can actually punish a boss. Like, that's normally how fighting works in real life and also in a lot of other games. That's why I've never been a big fan of those. And not only that, but I believe in those games that the AI had the ability to read your inputs, which allowed them to gain a lot of these cheap advantages over you, as Servum 17 described. But moving past that whole genre of fighting games, you know a game that really comes to mind that was actually designed by Capcom, and it could be easily related to Yakuza? I watched Servum 17 do a balls deep of a game called Beatdown Fists of Vengeance, and it's a game designed by Capcom, and it plays kind of similarly to Yakuza. It has some really great music too, and you know, it doesn't have the same level of complexity, I believe, like this game does, but it looked interesting when I watched Servum 17 do a balls deep of that game. That game released back on the PlayStation 2, but I'd be interested to see just what that game is like when you actually play it, because if Capcom actually made a game that's way better than Yakuza when it comes to a fighting system, then that's probably a game worth playing. And the music especially, I love the music in Beatdown Fists of Vengeance. Like, I play this game without audio, and I play Beatdown Fists of Vengeance music when I'm playing Yakuza Kiwami. Like, the music that plays when you're in the hole, the group battle music, the boss fight music, like, that game has some really, really awesome pieces of music. And Capcom clearly demonstrates how to make good fighting music that complements the fighting game nature of Beatdown Fists of Vengeance. And, like, you're playing as gang members, I believe, so that could easily be related to the idea of the Yakuza, because aren't Yakuza like Japanese gang members? And this game is literally called Yakuza. Like, the music that plays in Beatdown Fists of Vengeance perfectly fits the setting of Yakuza, in my opinion. And it's a soundtrack worth listening to. So, that game, if I only had that game, maybe it's a game worth playing. I mean, I'll have to see some initial gameplay on YouTube or something to actually get a better idea as to what that game is like before I give my thoughts on it. I mean, obviously, a game that you watch on YouTube is going to feel very different to actually playing it. And I should know, because I downloaded a game yesterday called Returnal, and I'm really liking the game. I'm even planning a blind playthrough where I'm going to be going through the game on my very first time, and I'm just going to be uploading those parts to YouTube. And when I first saw gameplay of Returnal on YouTube, it didn't look very interesting. It looked very average at best. But then I actually started playing it, and the game is a lot of fun. The combat's a lot of fun to experiment with. It's just the roguelike elements really bring the game's quality down in the early game. And what I mean is, every time you die or when you close the application entirely in Returnal, the environment's completely reset and you're forced back to the beginning of the game. So you're going to be running through the game again, but the environments are slightly different and the enemies are going to be slightly different. And I just think it doesn't work very well. It doesn't fit that whole nature to the combat at all. And when you're just removing all the checkpoints and you're having to run back through an entire area to get back to a boss, and the run backs in Returnal feel worse than any of the run backs in the Souls games. That to me is just a big problem. It's very tedious. It just leads to a lot of environmental fatigue, and you're spending more time just running through the game rather than actually participating in it. And not only that, but when you die or when you close the game and you reset back to the beginning, you lose a lot of items. I mean, you keep some permanent upgrades, but I don't entirely know what permanent upgrades you keep, but you lose your weapons and you have to start with a sidearm again. And at that point, why am I going to be searching the environment if it's going to be that easy for me to die? Because, again, it's my first playthrough, so I don't know what to expect. Which is why I've been going through most of the early game with just the sidearm. I've gotten to the second boss, I beat him in my blind playthrough, and I was doing it with just the sidearm. And I was enjoying it, but I mean, the third phase was garbage for that second boss. I mean, the first boss was really great, but then the second boss was definitely lower in quality because of that third phase. But the sidearms were pretty helpful, and the alternative fire, it sucks that you can't really designate what you get at the beginning when you reset the cycle. The game doesn't start you off with the tracker swarm in the beginning. It just gives you a random alternative fire, and they can be good, but then some of them are pretty bad, and they don't have a lot of utilities because of that. Like, just a lot of the incentive to partake in the roguelike elements or the RPG aspects are completely diminished by the way they've designed the checkpoint system and the way you die and how it resets all your progress. And that's just the one big problem I'm having with Returnal right now. The combat, I'm liking the combat right now. I mean, it can be a little weird at first when the whole idea of just slightly pressing the L2 button to do your normal fire and then holding down L2 to actually initiate your alternative fire can be very odd, but it's not too bad. And plus, you can already blind fire in that game, so having to aim normally isn't so much of an issue. So I definitely think Returnal, it's a game worth checking out. If the ending of it is going to be pretty bad, and I've already seen the plot of the game, and I don't know what the rest of the areas are going to be like, if they're bad, then I probably won't recommend Returnal. But the early game I'm really liking, despite the roguelike elements and the RPG aspects. And, you know, I've never been a big fan of RPG games because they never feel as good as the focused single-player games like Resident Evil or like Ghost Rider or a lot of the other games I've stated. And they sacrifice a lot of quality in order to satisfy a lot of these very cheap designs just to appeal to the arcadey nature of RPG-style games and roguelike games. And really the only RPG game that comes to mind that I've really come to admire as one of my all-time favorite games is Bloodborne. There's a reason why that game is considered to be one of the best games ever made, because it truly is. It's far better than Dark Souls. Dark Souls gets very old, the environments are very stale, the enemies are very boring and simplistically designed. And Dark Souls 3, it was a little different, but it was still very, very boring. And the creativity with your combat just wasn't encouraged that greatly in Dark Souls 3, whereas in Bloodborne, the combat is so creative, the weapons are really cool, the boss fights are a lot of fun, the Chalice dungeons I really like. I don't know why people hate them so much, probably because of the whole farming aspect. And then the music and story of Bloodborne feel truly phenomenal, and very rarely will a game ever touch me like that. That game barely gets anything wrong, and I can totally understand why it's considered to be one of the best games ever made. You just cannot go wrong with Bloodborne in the slightest. But that is the end of part 2 of chapter 6. And before I go, here are a couple of bloopers. I've just put this little black screen here in order to give me time to talk about this little tangent on Bloodborne. But the bloopers are about to start right now, and here they are. So this is a great example of why this game is not designed for multiple enemies in a single room, because you get stun knocked to death like that. This is a great example of why the grab is way too slow, and it gets interrupted by almost anything, and you lose heat so easily. Why they didn't make it faster, I don't know. And then this right here is a great example of why limiting the dodge's effectiveness between multiple styles is stupid. I was only able to do one dodge in the brawler stance, there's some phantom range. And this right here, the retaliation attack on the brawler stance can miss, and the lack of an omnidirectional block makes it worse. And then I nearly get hit out of a heat action cutscene, which is bullshit. Here's some phantom range. This right here, I try to dodge away, but I dodge to the right for some reason, and I get punished. And next up, we have this, where he hits me with phantom range again, and then next one, I stomp this guy and he stands up immediately, which is bullshit. And that right there, I'm trying to dodge forward and he dodges to the left. And that right there, Kiryu did the wrong dodge. He for some reason can do this very short dodge that doesn't cover a lot of range after an attack, and it can get you punished for no reason. And this right here, slow grab, and I get punished because of it. And then we have this, where the grab detection is atrocious, grab the wrong thing, and there's some phantom range again. Here's yet another instance where I'm dodging in the wrong direction, even though I'm pushing forward on the left analog stick. And then we have this where the detection on the heat action didn't register, and I get punished. And then the recovery time on this is way too slow. When you're trying to use the auto weapon use during the B stance, yet again, the same thing happened. And then right here I swapped to the rush stance, and I dodged the wrong way because the game is stupid and reading my inputs. Here's some more phantom range bullshit. And for this clip, the camera's moving very slowly, and this is where I decide to try to find some way to actually increase the speed of the camera rotation, and there doesn't exist any option to change the camera speed. That right there does not complement a fast-paced game at all. You need a fast camera speed, or at least a speed that allows you to keep track of enemies, if you want to complement a faster-paced game. And just based on what you've seen in the blooper section, it's definitely clear why this encounter is absolute garbage, and it's just going to represent the state of the encounters later on in the game. And I'm just going to damn this game to hell when I talk about the later encounters that occur in this game. But stay tuned for part 3 of Chapter 6. Thank you all for watching, and you take care now.